and welcome to the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City. I'm the Reverend Monica Dobbins, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to our service of worship this morning. If you're visiting with us today, you are our special guest, and we especially welcome you. We invite you to stop at the welcome table right outside this door in our fellowship hall after service. Let us introduce ourselves and get to know you as well. On this weekend, we remember the life of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who would have been 90 years old. An enemy of the people, a rabble-rouser, the most dangerous man in America, a fool for Jesus, and a champion for justice, who reminded us that our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. In our worship service today, we also remember our ancestor, a true statesman, Frederick Douglass, who proclaimed to America that we cannot wait for justice to descend gently upon us. We must rise up and seize it with our own two hands. And so, for life lived fully and without compromise, for justice claimed without fear, for passing the flame of righteousness from generation to generation, it is for these things that we light our chalice today. Symbol of light and of knowledge, symbol of warmth and freedom. We light this chalice today as a symbol of our faith. Here we gather to celebrate hope and the infinite possibilities of love. If you woke up this morning with freedom on your mind, I invite you to rise in body or in spirit, and let's sing it together. Number 153.
Oh,
This birthday weekend of Dr. King is a time at which we often recommit ourselves to the daily task of undoing systems of injustice, particularly the evil of racism. We understand that racism is not merely about bigoted attitudes. It is not the sole purview of people wearing hoods and burning crosses. Rather, it is a system of invisible barriers, blanketed with a snow of smiling faces and stifling sameness and surprised defensiveness, all serving to block the path forward for people of color, just as it has always been. We know that systemic racism is so resilient that it continues to flourish even in the absence of people who admit to being racist. In fact, often in the presence of people who swear that they are not racist at all. And we know that if we hope to undo it, we cannot avoid having difficult conversations. On the contrary, we need to lean into discomfort, especially our own. One of those places of discomfort under much discussion right now is the question of cultural misappropriation, the recognition that some groups of people have historically dominated and colonized other groups, and that there are many ways that we continue to do that. It is a habit of seeing a beautiful cultural product that we did not create and taking it for ourselves without reflecting on what it means for the people who created it in the first place. This morning, churches around the country, including ours, are singing the music of the civil rights movement, as well as music that was lifted from the Christian tradition and interpreted in the context of emancipation from slavery. Many of these churches, white folks like me, who have committed ourselves to learning new ways of disrupting white supremacy, are asking ourselves, is it okay to sing this music? My answer, take it or leave it, is yes. Yes, and. The reason I say yes is because we have been asked to do so. As a native of Birmingham, Alabama, it has been my privilege to know personally some of the people who took to the streets with Dr. King all those years ago, to know people who rode with the Freedom Riders, who registered voters in Mississippi, who treated black patients in white hospitals, or did any number of quiet, behind-the-scenes work for racial justice way back then. I know some of the children who marched in the Children's March. They're quite elderly now. And when you ask them this question, their answer is, please sing this music. Sing it often, not just on Dr. King's birthday. Sing it every day. Sing it loud. Sing it all the time. Otherwise, everything we worked for may be forgotten. And indeed, it is being forgotten. My home before I moved to Utah was in Shelby County, Alabama, the ignominious home of Shelby versus Holder, the end of the Voting Rights Act as we knew it. People suffered immensely for that legislation. Beatings, bombings, dogs, water cannons were just the sufferings we could see. And now it is disintegrating before our eyes. When those of us who are white sing the music of the African American freedom tradition, we must willingly enter into their story, their struggle, their suffering. We say to ourselves, I will never know this struggle myself, and yet I will never forget it. And I will commit to helping my siblings carry this burden with gratitude for our shared journey together. Sometimes, when we are learning to undo systemic racism, we anxiously search for rules to follow, rules we believe, will relieve the anxiety and give us more certainty about whether we are doing it right. But this is inherently messy work. There are no easy rules to follow, only relationships. So let us ask ourselves, am I honoring the relationship I have with the people whose work I'm performing or hearing or singing? How serious am I about that relationship? If I don't have such a relationship, why not? Remember, these stories I'm telling you, that's my relationship to the movement. What's yours? Segregation is pervasive. Society doesn't want us to be in relationship. We have to be intentional about it. It means opening ourselves to criticism, hard questions, uncertainty, messiness, heartbreak. But without those things, how can relationship be authentic? With that in mind, let us remember as we sing and as we listen to the music of our incredible choir that these songs are an act of worship, not a performance. Let us listen with humility and gratitude for the gift that we've been given, the opportunity to share in the struggle of humanity, the opportunity to let our hearts be broken. Clap in time with the music if you feel so moved, but remember that to our Black siblings, applause and clapping are also acts of worship and praise to a God that brought them through for 400 years. And let us remember today the inheritance of the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement, that none of us are free until all of us are free. Amen.
Just want to thank the choir. You took one of my favorite gospels and you did it proud. Thank you so very much for that. Good morning. Finding a reading on a Sunday that we are celebrating this morning is not easy. The canon of literature that addresses suffering and injustice is enormously wide, deep, and breathtakingly filled with horrors. And their accounts go back, of course, to Old Testament Hebrew Scripture, all the way up to the present time, and all the literature that has come together in the struggle for African Americans to alleviate their suffering and to find justice in America. It's boundless. So I've chosen, kind of arbitrarily, a piece written by the Associate Professor of African American Studies at Yale University. And I chose this particular piece for a number of reasons. One is because it mentions the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is in Montgomery, Alabama, which our own Monica Dobbins will be leading our high school youth later in this church year. They're going to go on a civil rights trip, and it'll include the museum in Montgomery. And so it kind of ties us a little bit closer with our high school kids who are going to be in for quite an experience. Also, this reading features Ida B. Wells, who happened to be a really good friend of Frederick Douglass, who will kind of be our focus this morning. And also I chose it because I learned something very new from this particular piece. We look back at the time of slavery and the horrors that existed, but I really did not know the extent of it until I read this particular piece on the lynching of black women. A woman was lynched, read a headline in the New York Times on August 20th, 1886. A mob had taken Eliza Woods, colored, from a jail in Jackson, Tennessee, and hanged her for supposedly poisoning her employer. The journalist Ida B. Wells protested the lynching in an editorial for the Gate City Press, a black newspaper in Kansas City. Eliza Woods was taken from the county jail and stripped naked and hung up in the courthouse yard, and her body riddled with bullets and left exposed to view. Wells later wrote in her diary, "Oh my God, can such things be, and no justice for it?" At least 130 black women were murdered by lynch mobs from 1880 to 1930. This violence against black women has long been ignored and forgotten. Not anymore. Eliza Woods' name is now engraved on one of the 800 weathered steel columns hanging from the ceiling of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. The inclusion of black women who were lynched is an important step in the long struggle to acknowledge the violent history of racial and gender inequality. When most Americans imagine lynching, they envision the tortured and mutilated body of a black man accused of raping a white woman. They rarely think of a black woman stripped naked and hung. Wells, however, was well aware that black women were victims of Southern mob violence and also targets of rape by white men. In 1892, when mobs across the South, I'm going to interrupt for a second, 1892, so this church was founded 1891. So I wonder what was going on in the conversation in this church when in 1892, mobs across the South murdered more than 200 African American men and women, including one of Wells's closest friends. Thus, she began to systematically investigate lynchings. She soon discovered that few victims had even been accused of rape. That few victims had been accused of rape. In an editorial, she wrote that nobody in this section of the country believes the old threadbare lie that Negro men rape white women. In retaliation, a white mob destroyed her press and warned Wells, who was in New York at the time, not to come back or risk death. Wells was not intimidated. Instead, she crossed the country lecturing on the evils of mob violence. She traveled to Britain, where she started an international crusade against lynching. She initiated one of the first public hearings to address both racial and sexual violence. Wells also sought to protect black women against rape by white men. She argued that the portrayal of black men as rapists put them beyond the pale of human sympathy. Let's inject the word Mexican, and it really sounds quite familiar. In other words, the portrayal of Mexican men as rapists put them beyond the pale of human sympathy. And then Ida B. Wells suggested that such a focus concealed the rape of black women, and it gave cover to whites' violent efforts to rob African Americans of their rights. A history of lynching must remember black women like Eliza Woods. It should recognize that the rape of black women devastated communities, in order to highlight how black women organized against rape and lynching. Anything less prevents one of the most radical movements of racial and sexual justice from speaking to the many challenges of our time. The memorial and museum in Montgomery are long overdue, and they represent a call to action that begins with an acknowledgement of hidden truths. along with their vitamins this morning, the choir took this pill that said spirit on it. Yeah, it's come to pass. Please take a look at your order of service, all the announcements, all the ways that our church stays active socially, educationally. It's filled with good stuff. The last call for auction items, please that's just kind of pulled out as a big announcement, which it is. Take a look and see if you don't want to perhaps support the church a little bit more by buying some of these activities that are available. This is the last call for that today. Also want to encourage you on Saturday, this coming Saturday, the board has long been involved in putting together a program of high engagement, facilitated conversation about building on the best of our past and shaping a bold future for the First Unitarian Church. It's a wonderful opportunity to kind of put in your thoughts, constructive things in terms of shaping the direction of this church into the future. The offering will now gratefully be received, a chance to greet one another and bid each other a fine good morning. In 1870, 5 black women were arrested for voting in South Carolina. This came at a time when the fever of women's suffrage was running pretty high, and the question of what constituted citizenship really distressed women of all races. In 1869, the year before the black women were arrested, Frederick Douglass, in his magnificent oratory style, argued that citizenship rested on human rights. In a speech he delivered in Boston, he asked rhetorically, "Who deserves citizenship and political equality?" His answer was clear. Not people of one descent or another, or of one sex or another, but all people. Now, David Blight, an historian at Yale, just published a phenomenal biography on Frederick Douglass called Prophet of Freedom. It runs 900 pages. But let me say, in the interest of time, that Douglass was born in Maryland in 1818, taught himself to read and write from scraps of newspapers and old spelling books. He escaped from slavery in 1838, disguised as a sailor. And living in New England, he began reading the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, namely his newspaper, Liberator. And 3 years later, 1841, he spoke for the first time at an anti-slavery meeting on Nantucket. When he finished speaking, Garrison took to the stage and asked the audience, "Have we been listening to a thing or a piece of property or a man?" And the crowd roared back, "A man." And 2 years later, Frederick Douglass had more than 100 speaking engagements and became one of the nation's best-known orators. But Douglass's deep belief in equality always seemed to hit a wall. In his monumental efforts to give black people the vote, he was repeatedly undermined by our own Constitution. Now, many of us will find that baffling still today. Not that there were any restrictions on the right to vote. In fact, the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, declared that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In practice, however, the 15th Amendment failed to protect the right of black men to vote because of a rising tide of terrorism found in frightening demonstrations of mob rule, as well as increased efforts by the Ku Klux Klan to take back the South. Nor did the 15th Amendment settle the question of whether or not women could vote. On the one hand, the Constitution didn't guarantee women the right to vote, but on the other hand, the Constitution never specifically barred discrimination by sex, only by race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In other words, the Constitution never said that women couldn't vote. So one of my favorite and most dynamic women in history, Victoria Woodhull, decided to test the limits of female citizenship, not only by voting, but running for office. Victoria Woodhull, a charismatic fortune teller from Ohio, moved to New York and reinvented herself as a stockbroker. She became the first woman to run for president of the United States. She ran as a self-nominated candidate of the party she helped create, the Equal Rights Party. In 1871, she announced, "We are plotting revolution." Now, Victoria Woodhull, if she were around today, would definitely have been one of the speakers in yesterday's women's marches. Woodhull argued ingeniously that women already had the right to vote under the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the Constitution, an argument she brought before the House Judiciary Committee, making her the first woman to address a congressional committee. She told the committee, "As I have been the first to comprehend these constitutional and legal facts," how's that for humility? "As I have been the first to comprehend these constitutional and legal facts, so am I the first to proclaim, as I do now, to proclaim to the women of the United States of America that they are enfranchised." Well, Victoria Woodhull spent Election Day in prison on charges of obscenity. Isn't that interesting? The Supreme Court ruled against her interpretation of the Constitution, clarifying for all that the Constitution did not automatically confer the right to vote on those who were citizens. So what was a citizen? Don't forget, Douglas said citizenship was based on human rights. But the Constitution never said that. Still, at the 1872 Republican Convention, with the taste of Victoria Woodhull's revolution still fresh in everyone's mind, the Republican Party, who were the liberals at that time, offered a polite token to the suffragettes. They stated, "The honest demand of any class of citizens for additional rights should be treated with respectful consideration." Hot air. No consideration was ever afforded. By the party's 1876 convention, marking the centennial of the Declaration of Independence, Sarah Spencer of the National Women's Suffrage Association said, "In this bright new century, let me ask you to win to your side the women of the United States." She was hissed and booed off the stage. At that same convention, Frederick Douglass, his hair streaked with gray, became the first black person to ever speak before a nominating convention. His approach was considerably different from that of Sarah Spencer. Her speech was one of pleading. Douglass was firm and engaging and pressed the delegates to the max. The question now is, he said, do you mean to make good to us the promise in your Constitution? The problem, however, was not just a matter of our country denying some voters the right to vote. The problem rested with the Constitution itself. It is about as ambiguous a document that you can find anywhere in the world. And it still presents huge issues of interpretation today. Bottom line, contrary to what we think we were taught, our Constitution offers no guarantees for the rights of its citizens. It's a slippery slope if there ever was one. We are not guaranteed the right of free speech, free assembly, or freedom of religion. It's just that there are no restrictions on those rights. For example, the First Amendment does not say everybody has freedom of speech and religion. Instead, the Constitution bars Congress from making laws that infringe on religious freedom and freedom of speech. Well, what then about the right to vote? The concept of universal suffrage first appears in the 14th Amendment, which says that states will lose congressional representation when the right to vote at any election is denied. And so the Constitution does not guarantee the right to vote, but merely says it will punish states that withhold the ballot, but does not require them to grant it. So little has changed in regard to a general attitude about voting rights since the 14th and 15th Amendments were adopted. It's still common to regard voting as a privilege. It's a privilege to vote, not a right. It's a privilege. An incident of citizenship granted to some, but not all. Now, this so-called privilege over the years has been made dependent on literacy, poll taxes, long residency, and lack of a criminal past. Now, none of these conditions would be allowed to restrict free speech, freedom of religion, just the right to vote. The right to vote remains complicated among all American rights. The Supreme Court still today will render decisions putting the right to vote in quotation marks. Still going on today. When Frederick Douglass spoke with powerful emotion around the country about the rights withheld from black citizens, it fell on deaf ears. It was too easy to interpret the Constitution to mean that the rights were never given in the first place. Frustration piled high for all those who sought equality and freedom through the right to vote. Not only was the Constitution ambiguous about these rights, which were never guaranteed, but the Constitution never defined what constituted a citizen. So here's the dilemma. Congress was unable to figure out the consequences of emancipation. All of a sudden, millions of people, once held as slaves, have been freed after the Civil War. What it meant for them to become citizens would depend on the meaning of citizen. At a loss, Congress leaned on constitutional scholars to find a definition of citizen. Although the word is mentioned 10 times in the Constitution, it was never clearly delineated. There were only references, like one had to be a citizen to run for the office of president. But what was a citizen? So this was the environment in which people like Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, Victoria Woodhull, abolitionists, suffragettes, tried to win equality as it was mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed with certain inalienable rights, so on and so forth. But our nation's reticence to offer equality in real, substantive terms reminds me of the thinking by white South Africans in trying to end apartheid. The whites insisted that apartheid, of course a big part of apartheid was denying black people the vote, but that was what kept the country from being totally destroyed. Black voters would undermine everything positive that a white culture had erected over time. Frederick Douglass, because of his stature, led a black delegation for an audience with President Andrew Johnson right after the Civil War. And he said to Johnson, "I have come to ask for equality before the law and to be fully enfranchised throughout the land. Extend us the ballot with which to save ourselves." So what happened? Andrew Johnson offered a defense of states' rights. The federal government could not enforce a civil rights law in every state. It reminded Frederick Douglass the law and majorities must be obeyed. Besides, and here it sounds like South Africa, besides, he said to Frederick Douglass, if the black man achieved his goal of equality, it would cause a race war. Well, Douglass did manage one claim to Johnson's face. The very thing your excellency would avoid, a race war, can only be avoided by the very measure that we propose, black suffrage. And then Douglass walked out. For the rest of his life, Frederick Douglass wrote one theme in particular. One of his themes that was most prominent in all of his speeches was this: slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot. God, it just reverberates with so much truth. Slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot. Frederick Douglass died in 1895. 34 years later, a new prophet of freedom was born, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And King catapulted into a leadership position just as the Supreme Court handed down its 1954 verdict on Brown versus the Board of Education. The High Court banned segregation in our nation's schools, which rested on the premise of racial inferiority. It was Chief Justice Earl Warren's first case, and the court established that segregation deprived the plaintiffs of equal protection under the law. Warren famously said, "We cannot turn the clock back to 1868, when the 14th Amendment was adopted, or even to 1896, when Plessy versus Ferguson was written. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." Now, the court could disavow Jim Crow laws, but not really dismantle them. The South resisted the Brown decision mainly through its own interpretation of the Constitution, claiming now that the Supreme Court had the audacity to repudiate the Constitution. The court rewrote, they said, the fundamental laws of our country. And Eisenhower was outraged by the court's decision. So I guess neither neither the President nor the South wanted to move their clocks ahead to a new era. On December 1st, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old seamstress, refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white man. The driver stopped the bus, asked her to move. She refused, so the driver called the police, who then arrested Rosa Parks. The next night, a 26-year-old minister named Martin Luther King Jr. was drafted to lead the citywide protest that would begin the following Monday. He addressed 5,000 people at Montgomery's Holt Street Baptist Church, far more than could really fit into that church, but every inch was accounted for. And King continued the tradition of powerful black oratory that extended back to Frederick Douglass. Masses of people at Holt Street were absolutely hushed in silence in anticipation of what this 26-year-old minister, can you imagine? I wonder, what would this 26-year-old minister say? And as he climbed the pulpit and looked out at the group, his first words were these. As you know, my friends, there comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. And the crowd started stamping their feet while crying out, "Yes, yes, yes." Can't you just feel the fatigue, the exhaustion expressed by Dr. King? I mean, African Americans, after all this time, still being denied their basic human rights in America. The black boycott of Montgomery's buses lasted 381 days. King was arrested for violating the state's anti-boycott laws. Oh, they had laws for that. In November 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that the Montgomery bus law was unconstitutional. The next year, 1957, Dr. King founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the long struggle for civil rights culminated in the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Legal barriers were overcome so all Americans, all African Americans, could vote. What is a citizen? Now, everyone here knows that there is still no guarantee for African Americans to have, in quotation marks, the right to vote, even now, 2019. The most comprehensive vote restrictions were passed just last year in North Carolina, with many states ready to follow suit this year. And where the 15th Amendment made it clear that felons could not vote while in jail, well, they could certainly vote when released from prison. But states' rights prevail. In Alabama, for example, in that state, more than 50% of black men are disenfranchised because of a prison record. Can't vote. There comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. African Americans have been fighting against domestic terrorism, state violence, police brutality, since before the days of Ida B. Wells' anti-lynching crusade and Frederick Douglass calling for the ballot, because without the vote, they were still slaves. And the struggle continues today. Stand your ground laws, intimidation at the voting booth, laws restricting voter registration drives, ridiculous voter ID rules, purging names from voter registrations. There's a real chill in the air today. You know, it kind of goes back to the words of Frederick Douglass, as though he were an oracle. Almost unimaginable. This is what he said. Our government may at some time be in the hands of a bad man. When in the hands of a good man, that's all well enough. But we ought to have a government so shaped that even when in the hands of a bad man, we shall be safe. Isn't that amazing? Well, we obviously have not shaped our government according to Douglas's specification. And as a result, all people of color are not safe. Charlottesville bears tragic testimony to that. So today, this Sunday, demands a time for reflection, introspection, circumspection. For us as individuals and for the nation as a whole, we need to think about this all real hard. The iron feet of oppression continue to trample upon people of color. And yes, all of us are tired. But the prophets of freedom, Frederick Douglass, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., inspire us never to surrender our hope nor our deep belief in equality. Equality. I mean, it is fundamentally what America is all about. I cannot believe otherwise. So be it. Can we turn our hymn books, please, to number 168? As we extinguish the chalice, I'd like to close with these words from President Obama's second inaugural speech. We, the people, declare today that the most evident of truths, that all of us are created equal, is the star that guides us still, just as it guided our forebears through Seneca Falls, Selma, and Stonewall. Just as it guided all those men and women, sung and unsung, who left footprints along this great mall to hear a preacher say that we cannot walk alone, to hear a king proclaim that our individual freedom is inextricably bound to the freedom of every soul on